So, hello everyone. So, welcome back to the ones that
Hi.
already watched our shows before. I hope my internet is working out here. I'm Caroline and this is Sara Mesquita. We are the founder of Dataviz Lisboa. We started out at our own passion for the broad field of Dataviz, and our goal is to promote the Dataviz community in Portugal that brings together anyone who wants to transform raw data into excessive and effective data visualization or design, information design. And for this aim, we organize talks and workshops, and this time it's our 10th meetup, and we're super pleased to welcome Isabel Meirelles for this one. And hello.
Olá,
Hello, Carolina. Hello, Sara.
So it's my turn to introduce Isabel. Isabel is one of the world's leading researchers in information design. She studied architecture and urban design at Faculdade de Belas Artes in São Paulo, Brazil. She also holds 2 master's degrees, one in history and theory of architecture from the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London, and one in communication design from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Currently, Isabel is a professor in the Faculty of Design at OCAD University in Toronto, Canada. She's also a researcher at the Visual Analytics Lab, OCAD University, and the author of this amazing book, the other way around, the Design for Information, an introduction to the histories, theories, and best practices behind effective information visualizations taught at universities around the world. Isabel is also the co-founder of Information Plus Conference, a biannual interdisciplinary conference, workshop, and exhibition that brings together researchers, educators, and practitioners in information design and data visualization. Actually, she's the responsible for us being here today, since I met Coro at the 2018 edition in Potsdam. Coro, do you want to share some words about this conference?
Yeah, I'm super pleased because Isabel, you're really one reason we started all that, because it was so nice, this conference. It brought together people from so many places. And as an IEEE, this is not so affordable for everyone. For us, it was astonishing to have these kind of speakers and this broad field of some scientific and artistic fields, academic fields, and within this breaks to even have the chance to talk to all these people. That was really amazing for us within this really great workshops where like it's names like the pudding, where we also met Sara and I, was amazing. So thank you for hosting that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I have to thank Marianne Dork as well and the whole team at Potsdam University, and for actually co-organizing and actually having the heavy lift of being the local hosts. Unfortunately, this year we had to postpone our, it is a biennial, so we're going to have it this year with Yanni Lokisas at Georgia Tech and an incredible team and program committee and all that, but we had to postpone it to next year because of COVID-19. So I hope everyone will be tuned, and I think
it will be in Atlanta, right?
It will be, yeah, the whole plan, we just really postponed. So we didn't cancel it. So the idea was that we eventually might have to have some change, site change in a few things. But the idea is that we will host it in September next year. The same whole group of people, eventually, hopefully, most of the program committee people who have committed, they might be able to commit again. So we'll have to get in touch with a few details. But the idea is that we'll be able to get together again.
Yay, super.
Yeah.
So please, Isabel, give us the honor to listen your ideas.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so let me go to my screen and share it. Can you see it? Okay. I cannot hear you. Can you see it? I hope so, right? Yes, okay, got it.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, good. I got it. Thank you. Sorry for the glitch. I only have one screen, so it's hard to check. So I just would like to start by thanking again Sarah and Caroline, and to all the participants for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. Where I teach and conduct research here in Toronto, in Canada, we always start our events with a land acknowledgement. And though I'm not on campus today due to COVID-19, and also today's holiday here in Canada, it's Canada Day, I would like to acknowledge that OCAD University is on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we live, work, and create. I also would like to acknowledge that I will mostly discuss Western news and visualizations, as unfortunately I lack knowledge of Eastern perspectives. To overcome some of my own biases about what is happening in the news, I will use materials selected by the longest competition in existence in this area, that is the Malofierge, and I will introduce Malofierge in a minute. Pretty much every new technology affects the way we gather, sort, and disseminate information. For example, the invention of parchment paper, or the printing press, and the smartphone. And so on the screen, I have actually an example that is not from the news, but basically showing 3 roadmaps created and to disseminate with very different technologies, but with the exact same task of how to make us move from point A to point B. So on the left, we have a medieval itinerary of routes from London to Palestine by Matthew Paris in the mid-13th century. In the middle, we have John Ogilvy's road to London, from London to Bristol, which was actually among 100 different street maps published in 1675. Among the innovations of these street maps were actually the use of scale of 1 inch to a mile. And of course, on the right, I imagine that everyone is familiar with and have been using Google Maps to create routes from going from place to place. And here I just mapped exactly the same map, same route of Ogilvy's from London to Bristol. So we could spend the whole talk actually just discussing what these technologies afford or hinder, but I really would like to discuss the use of infographics and data visualizations in newspapers. And my goal is to reflect on how changes in technology have affected the way we design and communicate data stories using visualizations in the context of journalism. So changes in technology affect many sides of how we communicate information, from how we gather, produce, and design the news, to how we reproduce, disseminate, and read the news. So if we take, for example, since what is considered the first newspaper, which is on the left here in 1609, and we have been reading the news on paper, and mostly on newspapers. And we still do it, or still many people do it. But since the 80s, we have also been able to read the news electronically with CompuServe in 1981, and then more widely with the web in the early 90s. And of course, more recently, we have been able to read and access the news on our phones and watches. Of course, during this long period, many technologies have affected the newsrooms in different ways. And for example, if we look at the 19th century, is a good reminder of the changes of how we have produced the news, such as, the invention of photography, telegraphy, telephony, and also that actually affected how we gather and produce, but also other ways that have affected how we reproduce and disseminate, such as the invention of linotype and monotype composing machines. We also see similar impactful changes in recent times, such as the speed and manner by which we access the web, which has greatly affected how we design the news, including, the computational capacity that has changed and it keeps on changing, as well as how we access data, including digital data and our own digital traces that we produce daily. Here is an example of an article by Ruben Fischer-Baum at the Washington Post, and that actually shows in a very playful way, reminds us of change in technology. I'll be sharing the slides later on, and so you don't need to take notes, so that you can actually access all the different resources that I'm sharing with you in the talk. So one of the things that I also want to discuss today is that when we design visualizations to communicate information, especially in the context of journalism, we design them in the context of the news and in consideration of the medium where it is being disseminated, as well as with knowledge of our audiences. So for that, we take into consideration the whole experience, not only of the experience of the visualizations themselves, but also of how it is inserted in the context of the news. So for here, example, it's interesting to see how the color code is used in relationship to the visualization and calling attention, going back and forth between the written article and the visualizations. Another obvious consideration, of course, is the medium that we use to disseminate. And so whether it's print, online, or phone. And here in this slide, I show the same article in the print newspaper and online. And this is actually the first time that the Malofiesh competition, which I'm going to explain more in detail in a minute, actually, awarded for the same article or the same set of visualizations, the best of show in both print and online. And so we see how the different medium invited for different orientations in the vertical newspaper and in the horizontal in the screen, and also how in the newspaper we have the annotations in the context and how we can see the whole at once, whereas on the online version, which was still at the time of Flash application, I'm going to talk more in detail soon, that actually we're constrained into a window through which we actually had to see things and explore. This is the second and perhaps so far the last time that the same article in print and online were awarded the best of show at Malofiesh. And differently from the previous example, here we see a different type of visualization being used for print from that was used on the online version. And because it has been updated and transported from Flash to HTML JavaScript, we can also now access it on our mobiles, and we see how now we have 3 different types of visualizations being used, each one for its different medium. And again, it brings to mind considerations that we'll have, and I would like to invite us to discuss today in terms of what is most appropriate for which medium and for what reasons when we are able to do that. So as I mentioned, and the 2 previous examples were recipients of Malofiesh. And so here is the recent award invitation for application, which was closed. Actually, Malofiesh started, let me just give a brief introduction, start its International Infographics Awards in 1993 to recognize the best infographics published in print and online across the globe. And since 2004, they have also awarded Best of Show awards showed two examples already, and since 2006, the best map. And its name, Malofesh, is actually the Argentinian cartographer Alejandro Malofesh, who died in 1987. And the Malofesh Awards is part of the Society for News Design chapter for the Mediterranean Europe that goes from Portugal to Greece. So every March, an international jury meets for nearly 4 days at the School of Communication at the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain, and they select the works worthy of gold, silver and bronze medals for among dozens or sometimes more than dozens of entries submitted for the competition. This year, due to COVID-19, they are still deliberating. I put here a recent tweet that they are actually going soon to be releasing the winners for this year's competition. So to give a sense of where the competition sits among different technologies, I put very briefly here a simple written timeline that inserts it, the competition among major technological events. And so in terms of technologies, I would like to point to the release of Flash Player 3 in 1998, which allowed designers to keep part of what we were used to have in control in terms of digital, in terms of print design, and which was not possible at that time with the lack of standards in HTML. And anyone who was in the newsroom at that time, which includes me, we remember how painful it was to transition from print to digital, and Flash actually allowed us to keep some of the control and storytelling that we were used in print. But I'll get to this point when we see some of the examples in a bit. And of course, Flash, the predominance of Flash falls apart when Apple stopped supporting it in mobile device in 2010. But of course, this would not have been possible also without the recommendation of HTML5 by W3, which enable us to this date to design free of plugins and with full capacity for interactivity with JavaScript and so on. So the second relevant aspect to point in this slide is the access to data provided by open data efforts, such as governmental data. So I'm going to look at online competition by Malofesh, and basically I'll focus. I have divided these in different phases so that we can see how technology has affected the use. So in this initial phase from 2000 to 2005, we mostly see graphics made using Flash applications and overuse of interactions and multimedia experience. We're going to see sound and video, mostly linear stories. They were self-contained, given that this was inside a plugin and not a native HTML. And there was the Gold Awards were mostly given to Spanish newspapers. So here, very quickly, we see a screenshot of what those medleys were. So you see that they were all contained within screens, and they were mostly Flash applications. I'm going to show here a movie, and I hope you can hear the sounds. You're going to see that basically all the sounds are, every time that you click, you would hear a click sound. So basically, what that was, and I hope you were able to see, I cannot see whether you were able to hear or not. In our little test, we were able to test it, but in any case, given that internet connection was very slow, and so there was a need to actually make certain that we would give a feedback to the viewers that things were happening. As they were clicking, you would hear the sound so that they would understand that the interactions were happening. And what was also very much an influence was that basically there was a lot of cinematic tools and strategies that were a lot of employed in those visualizations that were mostly visual explanations of phenomena. So during the second phase, which is pretty much goes from 2006 to 2012, we see still a dominance of Flash, which was the main application, the main way of actually creating those visualizations. But we see a larger amount of quantitative visualizations that we haven't seen so far, and less cinematic interactive experiences. So here we see some of the examples. So we see a lot of data driven in the way that we consider now visualizations that are quantitative data visualizations. And I'm going just here very briefly provide a little summary of some of the important issues that I think were devised during this time. One is basically some important ways in which we insert these visualizations in longer format of articles. So one strategy that was very much used during this period was the stepper or timeline, which actually, as we see here, that provides a number so that we can follow a linear structure of the story, or we can jump at any time, but mostly following what it was. So even though we can do the same with scrolling stories like as we do it nowadays with HTML, we no longer have the ability for non-linear of what these Flash applications allowed, for example, in this particular case. We also have lost some of the sense with the recent visualizations that are long stories of how deep the stories or how long those stories are, since most of them we don't know, although some use some strategies as dots or some bars that actually show where we are in the length of the story, but some of the things that we lost in recent days. So with quantitative data came standalones, exploratory visualizations in the news, such as this one that we see here, and which actually a relevant aspect to raise is that in this particular instance is that there were a lot of very innovative types of visualizations being used by the news. In this case, the screen graph, which was actually quite discussed at the time, especially when they won the Best of Show award. Here's another exploratory visualization, again, everything in Flash, and which actually in this particular case invites the reader to insert themselves in the graph by choosing the different filters that we see on the screen. This, I believe, is the first time that a movie was given the Best of Show award. It's an incredible piece that actually combines data and visual explanation, information about Mariano Rivera in baseball. And of course, we've seen an increase in the number of videos in recent times, given the mobile devices and our use of videos, but it started much sooner, as we see in 2010, 10 years ago, pretty much. Again, I'm showing this particular visualization that we saw in the beginning in relationship to its print version and the mobile, just to point out to the fact that with technology allowed the news to keep on updating based on evolving events. In this case, a visualization. The last time that it was updated was in 2018, which was actually 7 years after it was first created. In the third phase is pretty much a kind of a transition phase where we see the beginning of HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and a continuation of both quantitative and qualitative. As you see here, I'll very quickly show we start seeing the long pages getting long for the first time, and we still see the use of very innovative types of applications being devised, such as in the case of the Front Row Fashion Week by the New York Times, and also this early piece using 3D models and 3D maps in this aerial view of the reshaping of New York piece by the New York Times. This fourth phase, which I believe has started in 2015 and goes up to this date, still have to see what's going to be awarded this year, but mostly it relied mostly on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and the graphics were mostly inserted within the news, not standalones as we saw in the first phase. We also see that the importance of the mobile reading and the mobile first design, and how that actually ended up imposing certain restrictions on interactions. And we started seeing a lot of static visualizations and limited amount of interactions, and mostly a lot of very long vertical scrolls. Let's look at some examples here. This is one, you can see the really the length of this article, which with incredible maps and incredible visualizations, which actually kept being updated. So if you go to the URL once I share the slides, you're going to see that it looked different, and there are many dates that actually at every time that they kept updating. This, I believe, was the first time that a scrollytelling was awarded the Gold Medal by The Guardian in the US. The US section of The Guardian in the UK, I should say. And it's also relevant to point out to the importance of trying to humanize the data, and with bringing faces and different voices. Something that we see more and more being considered nowadays. And it's worth mentioning here, since Caroline mentioned the pudding, that actually storytelling is a form that was popularized by the pudding, and I hope you all are familiar with it, but I can always include a slide or a note here when I share the slides. Other innovations that we see in technology is actually inviting the viewer to add their views onto the page and capturing those, as in this case, example of the New York Times, of the first of a series of You Draw visualizations, and that also helped with making us check our own biases against our views in very important topics. So what this also tells us is also, in part, even though this is a very serious visualization, but how actually gamification was incorporated with the news, even though there are other examples that would be better rather than this one, but with quizzes or other forms of games that we see being part and used in the news. This article is here to show another more subtle use of technology, which is actually by the IP address. So pretty much what this article does for readers that are in the US, wherever they open these, the map would open where their IP address would point them to, and all the information in the tables and text would be showing information specifically to that particular location, which I believe is something that actually is less visible, so to speak, but actually is one of the strategies mostly used by the news to help us engage with the news by situating ourselves in what is relevant to us of where we are. When Malofiesh was 25 years old, I actually was part of the jury at that time. The jury decided that the best of show would go to a social media, so to a GIF. So it brings a new technology, the social media, showing things in very small format and in GIFs, very short loops, but that it can actually be very informative. And a lot of different newspapers have made use of this format, which is very condensed in all sense of the word, space and time, condensed to inform in different ways. We've seen so far also, very briefly here, how video and interactivity and visualization have been very well integrated. This is a beautiful example by Kennedy Elliott and colleagues at the National Geographic. Again, putting us on a different perspective, almost like the video games putting us flying over the border, in this case, that goes from point to point of the border between US and Mexico, in this beautiful piece by the Washington Post. It's too bad that, given the time, that I cannot be showing this piece, but if there is time or questions, I can always go and open the interface. And the last technology that I've seen more interesting is actually using the scrollytelling technique, not to scroll through the article itself, but to scroll within the visualization. So it's almost like what we saw in the very beginning with that stepper or the timelines of the flash time that we would use to navigate within the visualization. Now the scrollytelling technique is being used to navigate within the visualization, as in this case of the New York Times, looking at the delays in the subway in the New York system. So to summarize, the initial phase, given the lack of HTML and CSS standards, we saw a dominance of the Flash application or software and the way of up until around 2012. And of course, have to keep in mind that Apple bans Flash from mobile into 2010, and the HTML5 starts around 2012. In this initial phase, we saw infographics and visualizations that were mostly self-contained and had very specific ways of navigating, such as tabs and steppers, and were mostly self-contained, and the news and the text was in the context of this window where we were positioned. With the HTML CSS standards, we start seeing rich interactions, mostly quantitative graphics that starts a little earlier, but also mostly nowadays are major, mostly quantitative. And in my view, the lack of standards between large, meaning desktop or mobile or laptops, and small screens, meaning our mobile phones, has imposed changes in interactivity, and with a lot of static visualizations now being used by many newspapers, and a lot of video, I should say, and long formats that actually pretty much use the scroll that we very much do as well in the mobile. I actually have to do one last thought that eventually, very briefly here, that is not particularly from the news, but I would like just to talk in terms of bringing the pandemic, since almost all talks now have to talk something about pandemic, and in specific about map projection. So I would like just to start with this beautiful page on the Fortune magazine from 1942 by Richard S. Harrison, which could be actually published nowadays. It actually shows the trajectories of 300 correspondents of three news media, the Time, Life, and Fortune, over a period of a year, and where they went and for how long and how many times. So we see the width of the lines. But more important here is the use of the projection, the use of the map projection, that actually is very appropriate. And not only that, but also that actually, as you see here, as I zoom in, so pardon for the lack of quality, but how it helps us understand what the projection, the polar projection in this particular case is, how to read it. So of course, we all know that there is a myriad of projections and how important it is to choose the right projection for the task at hand, given our understanding of the geometric properties that one needs preserved with minimized distortion. As Robson warns us, there is no such thing as a bad projection. There are only good and poor choices. So we all know that Google Maps use a variant of the well-known Mercator projection, which is called the web projection, web Mercator. And here I'm showing, highlighted where they mentioned that. We know that the Mercator projection was devised by Mercator, the person who gave the name, in 1569 for the purpose of nautical navigation, and that areas and shapes vary with latitude, especially away from equator, reaching extreme distortions in the polar regions. And so here I'm just showing the true size of website. If you're not familiar with, it's actually quite incredible. So you can select a country. Here I selected Brazil and Greenland, and actually move it around to see the distortions as if we put it around based on the Mercator projection. And yet, and that's the reason for this last thought, one of the most viewed visualizations in North America, at least, I don't know, in Europe, which was done by the Johns Hopkins University, which has created an incredible service, but they are using the Mercator projections, right? Of course, perhaps I would say for the easy of which we can use Google Maps API, but still it actually interferes and influences how our readers and viewers will interpret information. The good news is that basically most newsrooms around the world have moved away from the Mercator projection. Just showing here two examples, like the Financial Times has been doing a fantastic work in terms of actually advancing incredible visualizations about COVID. And here, the Washington Post, which actually not only use an appropriate map projection, but also decentralizes Europe from the center, which we pretty much are used in most of the time, right? Given the political center of where the world was, and actually repositions it politically. So again, visualizations are not neutral, and we all know that, and requires that we take many ethical considerations. And I believe technology is and should be considered among those ethical considerations that we take. So in this brief talk, I attempted to call attention to how technology affects what we do, how we need to make informed choices when designing visualization, so that we can use the technology that is available to us, but also with informed choices. So I'll leave you with my email in case you'd like to contact me, and I will stop sharing I'll stop sharing this.
I can do that for you.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, yeah, thank you very much. That
I don't know
was
if it was too long.
no, it was a really nice
perfect.
travel through the time of data visualization. Like you really took us from the beginning with it, and I still had some great insights. As for example, I really have this challenge with this Mercator map in my daily work. I always want to have a more real visualization and using it. And I always run into it having a free source because clients don't want to pay for it.
Yeah.
Or please, cheap. And and the other stuff you mentioned, what's always a question coming up is what do you think about the aspect of saying in the user experience, you say mobile first often, but I think in data visualization, it's still changing maybe the approach to say it's about the data visualization, or should we even within the newsrooms now say all the time mobile first, small devices? What do you think?
Yeah, so basically we know, right? There are numbers out there that tells that many people are reading their news in mobile devices. And because of that, and because the difference in interactions. So for example, just a simple one with the mobile device, we lost hover, right? So we no longer can hover over something as we can still in desktop or laptop. And so we lost one type of interaction. So we can only click on things. And because there are so many, there's iOS, there is, all different types of technologies. So one has to check in so many if the visualization or the types of interactions that you're creating is actually possible to interact in the Google phone or iOS phone and on Android phone, I should say, or iOS. Mm-hmm. So it is very expensive. It's very expensive to check these different technologies. So in the past, when I started, creating those things in late 90s, right, we were checking against different browsers, Explorer and so on. So if there is anyone online who were on that time, knew the nightmare that it was. Now the nightmare continues, but it's mostly between, the web and the mobiles and the different web browsers and the different mobile browsers, right? And so, yeah.
So actually, it's even a bit about the budget right now.
I think it has always been about budget, right? So in a way, it is money plays a huge part in how we communicate the news, especially newspapers, right? That actually is something for us to consume on a daily basis. And traditionally, we would trash the newspaper. That's why it was cheap paper. That's why eventually, I even had a whole section that I removed from my talk that actually showed the comparison between newspaper and magazines. So I mostly worked in magazines. And so we always had the luxury of having better paper and more time to produce things because people are not going to trash newspapers as one does on a daily, or on something that is supposed to give the news on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. There we could actually nearly add, we had this a bit the topic in our private talk last time, the different countries and the different newspapers, the levels and within the countries. As I'm still my background is Germany, of course. So I follow a lot of digital data visualization from German newspapers, and it's different from the Portuguese newspapers, of course, and the resources, and I guess as well from Canada or Brazil, as you have also the background and connection. Yeah. That's another challenge we're still all working on, and I sometimes think the digitalization actually helps everyone. There are more sources like this talk even to inform people, to help us each other, the community grows, but on the other side is also, I don't know if it's about the willing, the knowledge, or the resources. What do you think sometimes?
Yeah, I think it's the resource. So we all know that journalism has been affected, by, financial issues along the, by people reading free material online or not willing to pay for the news. So it has affected journalism in different ways. And but also the resources that different newsrooms are able to have, right? So the newsrooms in the New York Times, I believe it's more than 30 people. I don't remember now, but it's really huge, and sometimes it's larger than newsrooms around the world. There was a tweet that I actually had captured that I was going to put, and I forgot to include, that recently the Washington Post is actually hiring designers to work in visualizations at the Washington Post, and they're really looking at a large number to hire recently, which basically, and there was a talk of, oh, this is actually larger than many. Just the number that they're hiring is actually larger than the number of people in many newsrooms around the world. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I kind of lost my track here. I don't know if I
think, yeah, and I think that's like a broad discussion. We should have a beer over in person.
Yeah.
And we have
more questions here coming. So I have one here to show that says, depending on technology used, several of your examples are kind of ephemeral, hardly future-proof. Should we worry? Isabel,
Okay, I don't know if I quite understand. So depending on the technology, the examples are kind of ephemeral art, future-proof. So, I don't know if I understand, but I think all the examples that I brought, they were published in major newspapers, and they were mostly awarded medals. That's why, I explained that I was using the recipients of medals of Malofesh just to overcome my own bias against lack of knowledge of other media that I don't particularly read. And so one of the points that I made was that in the beginning, when things were starting, there were more playful and perhaps even more innovative types of visualizations that were being attempted. So I showed that with the stream graph, and there were other ones, even recent ones like the aerial view of the Washington Post that we saw in other visualizations in the past. So I don't know if they're talking about this one or if they had a chance to update their question.
I also don't.
I hope.
No, Sarah, say.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's like
I was just. Okay, so the person that actually made the question, maybe he can explain it better. We have more here to show.
I just want
to. Okay. Yeah, of course, Coro, go ahead and finish the previous one.
No, I just thought we could, for me, it fitted a bit, maybe if I understood right, about the question I had in mind as well, about the aesthetical pleasing graphical interfaces. As it is like more, I will put that one up. For me, was a bit like, because I think that fits, maybe if I understand it right. It's like some people perceive this as a truer self. So like with even this Malphage is putting a gold or silver rod, and sometimes it's often, of course, functional, but as well also artistic a bit. And I think we're going into a nice cross version of everything. So like your conference, for example, where you also try to bring together different points. But what do you see? Is it with the issue of aesthetics in the field of data visualization?
Yeah, I think it's super important. I think I agree with what is on the screen right there, that, there are studies that show that aesthetically pleasing graphical interface. I don't know if the studies show that they are perceived as truer, but there's studies that I've read. I haven't read that part about considering more true than not true, but I've seen studies that actually have showed that people have they are more memorable, so that people remember more when they see something that is visually more engaging. And so whether that is more considered more true or not, I don't quite remember seeing the study, but I will look for it. But I think statics is something to be considered. It should be balanced. I think we all. So let me think here. There was a lot of discussion in the very beginning with Tufte, for example, in terms of bringing issues of data junk and what would that be considered. So I think we overcame that problem for a while. I should say that actually there is that things in visualization are more nuanced, and that there is an importance to actually bringing statical or visual qualities that are relevant to the context in which the visualization are inserted. And yeah, so and how do so I think I answered more the second part rather than the truer part. I think in general, just as a quick note here, that basically visualizations in general tend to be considered true because they are like a picture. So whether they are aesthetically pleasant or not, we actually have to take those the aspect into consideration in terms of being ethically considerate in terms of, you know, the data quality, the data gathering, or all the biases that we bring into when we design visualizations, so that we help our viewers be more informed. So I hope that answered.
So we have the explanation here, so I will just have it.
Okay.
Maybe it can help.
Future-proof in the sense that it will not have the technology anymore like Flash. Okay. Yeah, Flash was a savior, I'd say. Right? So it's when I started, so it's actually, you know, coding ActionScript, which was a pain, and because they kept changing and changing. So it was like I was happy when Flash died, and I was unhappy when Flash died. So it was both a joy and a pain to coding Flash and designing Flash. But it actually helped a lot in terms of innovation. And as I was actually doing a research when I was invited to go to Malofie's 25th anniversary and write a short article about it, I looked back into the past and I was amazed by the number of innovations that somehow are coming back as for example, videos are coming back into fashion. So now we have traditional newspapers like the Financial Times, right, or The Economist, or many others that are actually creating their own videos and actually having their own YouTube channels. And so it is, but if we look back into the past, we have an incredible amount of videos being used because it was Flash was a software designed for animation. It was to create little movies. So it was actually the beginning of it. It was not particularly designed for visualization. People were using it more in the storytelling aspect of the journalism rather than on the visualization itself.
I think we can add here really well another question from the audience who asked, of all the most recent visualizations you showed, how many are built using open source tools only? So after Flash.
Yeah, so pretty much Flash was, one of the problems was not only that you had to pay for the application, but also you had a plugin. So it was a lot of hurdles, technological hurdles that, as I said, I was very happy when it died, right? On the other hand, we are now mostly reliant on open source. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, they're, code. And so pretty much they are all free for anyone to create on top. There are other libraries and tools. So, for example, in HTML, there is this incredible library. I showed one slide actually of Mike Bostock and G3, which is a major library for creating visualizations using JavaScript. And there are others. There are other tools like React and others that actually use in combination with mobile devices. But I think most nowadays are free. I think the cost now is actually the time of coding and combining all these different technologies into working together, into creating an experience that is meaningful to the viewer and reader.
Does that help, or actually is a burden? Because then if we combine all of that technologies, maybe we have like these drag and drop ones just that doesn't allow you to be that creative. So you think the way is to be more like just one technology and that combines every aspect, or keep this way, that creating new features, new technologies, new add-ons, and so on?
Yeah. So I think, you mentioned two things, I think, that we can separate. One is actually there are many tools available, like Data Wrapper, which is amazing, right? So that is based in Germany. And I showed some of the work by Gregor Aisch, who is one of the major people there at Data Wrapper, co-founder. And that actually a lot of newspapers around the world who don't have enough capacity in terms of having a whole team creating visualizations for lack of knowing how to code and so on. They use, and you see, newspapers in Brazil or in Portugal. I was looking the other day, actually visualizations made using Data Wrapper, which is fantastic. That's what these tools are. So there is one point is that, right, that there are now many applications that are free or have subscriptions that newsrooms or us individual people can use to create visualizations and start learning about creating visual information. And the other aspect that you raise is about the innovation aspect and how those built-in kind of more statistical graphs that are ready-made, as you put it, or something like that, right? That actually might stop us from innovating. I think there is still room for innovation, and some of the tools that we saw, some of the examples that I showed, both in recent and past, present interesting, innovative types of graphs, like we saw the stream graph there, right? So I think the technology is there to help us rather than to hinder us, even though there are constraints imposed by technology that we should learn how to take advantage of them.
I think for a lot, because we get this question a lot, like what tools should I use? What should I start with? And I think it's a bit, one point we have to differ, for example, Data Wrapper, for example, I think is really good for newsrooms. So it could be like a tool for you to learn, or it's what you mentioned a bit about the magazines and newspapers, the difference. So if you do a private project or something bigger about, so maybe you use other tools then. Or I just read the quote today, like what's Word for writer is Illustrator for data visualization person, what I would not totally agree to, but I think it's hard to give an exact answer because I'm redeveloping, and I think you should see what you start with, and any tool starts. I see like great people out there, they work with mainly the Illustrator, and then you have somebody beside who helps them with coding and animating, or some other people working with Data Wrapper or RawGraph, who's also putting out a new good version.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. I think that for me, I believe that, a lot, we can still start with pen and paper, even though I think there is a danger of actually being too much, especially this. Sorry? too much,
please go ahead.
especially in education. Like sometimes I see students who get too much in love with what they design in a paper, and then when they analyze the data, they see that it doesn't fit, right? So there are many challenges here, especially as we work with very large data sets, and really being respectful to the data and not imposing any kind of structure that what we want it to be, right? Is actually working from inside out so that the data can speak and can that we are able to show what the data. But again, there is no one data possibility, right? Because we all know that there is not only one way to look at data, and you know what is missing in the data or what is in the data. So there are different ways to show. Like I had one example last slide that I kind of removed that are actually showing what is not in the data, right? And so, but yeah, Caroline, you mentioned raw graphics, which is amazing, done by Density Design in Milano, Politecnico di Milano. Also Flourish more recently for people who would like to use, or Illustrator, right? That is if a lot of people actually develop certain things and then take it back to Illustrator just to refine or change a few details before they print, for reports, for example. I think there are important considerations that we take as before we choose the tools. What is it that we are trying to visualize? Even within the same data set, different questions or different perspective or different tasks can actually tell us different ways we're going to visualize and choose different tools, from different map projections to different types of visualizations, including more innovative or standard. There is nothing wrong with standard. So in that example of the we draw, it's a line graph that we are drawing. And yet the innovation is not in the line graph, but it's actually in the action that we are invited into, which is to draw the line graph, to actually question our own biases about that particular data. So I think, or reading the IP address. So there are many innovations that are perhaps less visual and as important as
Yeah, there's adding another question we have, what I think fits here really well is like this question about, for example, I'm having the design background and Sarah is more from the data background as me. So for me, it's often what you said. I have this pen and paper and I have this awesome idea. I put it in some, for example, in raw graph to have a bit of a notion of the data. But for me, it's sometimes hard to grab the data really. So I need someone like Sarah to work with me. And sometimes it's the other way around. So we have always these questions on the Meetup to ask what we want to learn.
Yeah, totally.
And a lot of people add like, I want to know how can I present the data? So what is this visual output on the end? So what do you think, what's a good start for us to combine really these two skills or to learn from each other?
Yeah, so I think we need to start with the data, you know, and pretty much, at least that's even how I teach. I really start by, you know, once you have the question, once you have the data, before is the question, let's say we want to understand a particular issue. And then we have to see, you know, how to understand that particular issue. Do we have access to the data? Do we have to gather the data? If we have access to the data, how the data was collected? Was it, for what purposes was it collected? Because probably it's for a different purpose than what we are trying to visualize. But I think we need to to consider all aspects of the data before we even start to visualize. And it's not just the analysis, but actually all these questions prior to the analysis, right? Because most data sets are incomplete. Most data sets serve a particular purpose for the purpose for which it was collected. Yeah, So where to start? I think also the idea of the collaboration, like you mentioned, actually more and more I try to get people working in groups, because I think we need to understand that we need to collaborate. We have limited knowledge and that we need to share. So there are certain moments that we need to pretty much have the help of a statistician. Even if we know a little bit of statistics, we need someone who actually has more, or the help of an expert. There's good discussion about COVID in terms of having actually epidemiologists, expert knowledge, as we devise those visualizations. So
yeah, definitely. So sorry, Isabel, go ahead.
No, I think there is no simple answer. Quite honestly, it's like I feel a little bit that I'm not giving perhaps a simple answer. I don't think there is a. I think at different as this person who asked, as you are facing the problems, you should, at every time that you are facing any problem in visualization, should ask who would be the people who can help you best, and what are the things that you need to better know in order to start designing and knowing and understanding the data, and going back and forth. So it's an iterative process. It's not easy. And I think the more people we gather, the better we will be. Yeah.
Maybe more of your workshops that you're offering within your conference and stuff like that.
Yeah.
At least I think that stuff that helps.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Yes, I feel that the fields like statistics or more quantitative fields are not that trained in the thinking creative in terms of like design. So and that's a pity. I would like to, for like my colleagues and the people that I work with, or like from more quantitative fields to understand the importance of design and to present their findings in a better way, visually. I mean, so yeah, so it's workshops can help definitely. Because sometimes we have like the faculty of design here, the faculty of engineering there, and there's no much interaction going on, only maybe in the upper level, maybe. So I think it would be nice to have like a program that puts these professionals together, or like these workshops, somehow to put these minds together and to create better solutions for both.
Yeah, I agree. And it's what I find interesting is that basically, because reading in different areas, and so when I read a computer science article or a statistician article, or medical article and so on, so we are all dealing with visualizations for a long time, quite honestly, right? And we all have our own expertise. So eventually, as a designer, I bring more of the design, and I have limited, unfortunately, I wish I had more knowledge of statistics, for example, right? Or of programming. And so I would need to actually provide to my students more knowledge about the areas that they lack, that their education didn't provide them with enough. Whereas for, let's say, a statistician, like you mentioned, eventually might need more knowledge about the design aspects, or the design considerations, or the ethical considerations, for that sake, right? And so I think that's why if we think a lot more, and I like what you just said in terms of the silos of how we all work isolated, and should be talking more, especially for an area that actually involves so many disciplines and so much knowledge. So there are people who actually are these incredible hybrid people who have a very deep incredible
unicorns.
Exactly, right? Who actually have incredible knowledge of computation, incredible knowledge of data analysis, and incredible design capabilities. And so, but these people are few individuals. And but most of the time, I really believe that we should be working more together. Hey, let's do something together, the three of us.
Would be nice. Definitely. So, Coro, one more question and we finish?
Yeah, we had one more from the audience. Yeah. So, yeah, we have this one here. Do you believe that this reshaped storytelling, diving back into the data viz and not only in the textual content outside the graphics, is it in changing how we perceive the information?
Diving back into data viz and not only the textual content. Okay, so I again, it's like so hard, right? It's like this, the part that I miss the most about this is actually not being able to ask back, oh, what do you really mean by that? But let me try to interpret and what you're trying to say here. So whether, inserting, diving back into data and viz.
I think they mean the annotational, if I understand right. Like that we go more and more into the storytelling with text as well. So like you have the visuals and parallel the text and you're scrolling through it, if I understand that right.
Okay. So I think everything that we do interfere with perception and interfere with interpretation. And so even with the best of intentions that we might have, our decisions about everything, right? Everything carries rhetoric, right? And carries a potential interference of in how people are going to perceive and interpret the information. And so with that caveat that everything that we do involves compromise and involves interference, and that's why I think it's important to have an informed process and an intentional one so that we can actually control for how we hope people will receive what we are trying to communicate. I believe that what we have learned from these past 25 years or actually, 20 years pretty much since 2000, right? The online, that's more or less where I started the visualizations there, is that basically what we have is like different forms have been experimented that were autonomous, that they were kind of isolated, self-contained, because of the technology imposed that kind of specificity that we had to look through a window and not be inserted inside the whole context of the story, to nowadays that we actually have the visualizations much more inserted back into what they were in the past in the print. When we looked at old newspapers, we would see long pages with visualizations inserted within the text, right? So pretty much we are kind of much more in a similar way connected to the past, our past tradition, than what those flash period there was in terms of being very isolated outside of the whole context. I believe that giving context is fundamental to actually helping anyone understand anything, whether the context is through annotations inside the visualizations themselves, helping convey why a peak here, why a dip there, or what to look for, or say that, other things happening during that time. Any kind of annotation is fundamental in my view. And if we are able to actually contextualize everything else as well with words, so that words and visuals can work together into conveying the larger picture, because we know as people who design visualizations that that's not the entire story. It's impossible to convey everything about the data in one singular visualization. We need even with many visualizations, it's almost, we need to actually bring other voices and bring other contexts with text. So I don't know if that actually answered it. Yeah.
No, I would also agree that actually it's a really nice explanation you brought. I didn't thought about this like that. Like we had that all actually singular or in a newspaper bit together. And that is actually bringing it together now, like with the storytelling and the annotation and highlighting special points and stuff. Yeah, it's...
I hope the person answered a little bit sad side too.
No, all fine. It was... oh, wait, this is too much covering.
Kick me out, kick me out, kick me out.
No, it's okay. I want to have us three here because it was amazing. I really enjoyed that talk, listening to you and now us three here and celebrating our 10th meetup.
Yeah.
And again, it's your fault, you know that we meet and start that.
I'm happy to be blamed.
Yes.
And I've been watching, since I've known about you, and you're doing a fantastic job. So congratulations to you, really. It's really amazing that you're bringing incredible people and also making all these videos available. So I'm now hooked into your meetup, and we'll continue following you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Isabel. It was a pleasure. So now I should announce the next speaker.
Yes, I will just, Isabel, once we have some space on the screen.
Okay.
But see, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you put the next one?
Yes, if you announce it.
Yay! So we'll have a next speaker. Will be Rodrigo Medeiros next week on the 8th of July. It will be the first time in Portuguese. So I'm sorry for the ones that are non-Portuguese speakers, but join us. We will be discussing the path that Brazil took to until today, how they are behaving in terms of data visualization now, how the communities are growing there. And compare maybe a bit with Portugal, if we are like what can we learn basically with them? Because I'm seeing a lot of good stuff. So join us. It will be a very lively talk, I'm sure. So yeah, very great news, and keep joining us. We have more, even better news to come. It's like, this is being great. These online events are very good. We're working very good. So yeah, we have a lot of things, good things to show you.
Yes, we will share the slides from Isabel. Thank you all for staying with us and asking those questions. And we're looking forward to the next event to welcome you again online. So
thank
you. Tschüss.
Thank you very much. Bye bye. Beijinhos. Até a próxima.